The final hours of Adolf Hitler were not marked by victory, glory, or defiance, but by silence, fear, and the collapse of a world he had built on lies. As Soviet artillery closed in on Berlin in April 1945, the most powerful and destructive man of the 20th century vanished behind the concrete walls of an underground bunker. What happened next has haunted history for decades. Did Hitler take his own life, as official accounts claim? Was he assassinated by his inner circle? Or did he escape, leaving behind a carefully staged death? The question is not just how Hitler died, but why so many refused to believe the truth. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was no longer a 1,000-year empire. It was a dying state, collapsing under the weight of its own brutality. Allied forces advanced from the west, while the Red Army crushed German resistance from the east. Berlin, once the proud capital of Hitler's vision, was reduced to rubble. Inside the Führerbunker, beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler lived his final days cut off from reality, surrounded by loyalists, traitors, and the echoes of his own failed decisions. Hitler's psychological state had deteriorated sharply. Once a commanding orator and master manipulator, he had become paranoid, physically weakened, and obsessed with betrayal. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his face aged beyond recognition. He lashed out at generals, blaming them for defeats that were the direct result of his own refusal to retreat or compromise. Even as Germany burned, Hitler continued issuing imaginary orders to non-existent armies, clinging to delusions of miraculous reversals. This mental collapse was not sudden. It was the final stage of a personality shaped by absolute power and ideological fanaticism. Hitler believed himself chosen by destiny. That belief had driven his rise, and now it ensured his fall. He could not accept defeat, because defeat meant the death of his identity. In his mind, Germany did not deserve to survive if it failed him. On April 29, 1945, as Soviet troops fought just meters away, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief, hollow ceremony. It was not an act of hope, but of finality. That same night, he dictated his political and personal wills, blaming Jews, generals, and the world for the catastrophe he himself had unleashed. Responsibility, even at the end, was denied. The next afternoon, April 30th, Adolf Hitler retreated into his private room. What happened inside was brief, deliberate, and witnessed only by history's aftermath. According to multiple consistent testimonies from those present, Hitler bit down on a cyanide capsule while simultaneously shooting himself in the head. Eva Braun took poison beside him. Their bodies were carried outside, doused in fuel, and burned in the garden of the Chancellery as Soviet shells exploded overhead. Why burn the bodies? Because Hitler feared humiliation more than death. He remembered the public display of Mussolini's corpse in Italy. He did not want his body paraded, mocked, or desecrated. Even in death, control mattered. When Soviet forces reached the site, they recovered charred remains. Stalin, suspicious by nature and politically motivated, initially fueled uncertainty by suggesting Hitler had escaped. This ambiguity gave birth to decades of conspiracy theories, rumors of submarines, secret bases, and sightings across continents. But science, documents, and testimony told a different story. Dental records recovered by Soviet forces were later confirmed by Hitler's own dentist's assistants. The jawbone matched perfectly. No credible physical evidence ever supported escape theories. Every serious historical investigation, from Western intelligence to post-Cold War forensic analysis, has concluded the same truth. Hitler died in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. The myths endured not because the evidence was weak, but because the reality was unsatisfying. Many wanted Hitler punished, exposed, publicly destroyed. Suicide felt like an escape. Yet in truth, his end was not victory. It was total defeat. He died underground, isolated, abandoned by the nation he claimed to embody, leaving behind a continent soaked in blood. The consequences of his decisions were catastrophic beyond measure. Over 60 million lives lost, cities erased, families destroyed, an entire generation traumatized. His ideology, rooted in hatred and supremacy, proved not only morally bankrupt, but self-destructive. In the end, Hitler did not just kill himself. He dragged Germany to the edge of annihilation and shattered the illusion that absolute power could ever be controlled. The truth of Hitler's death is not mysterious. What is disturbing is how ordinary its ending was. A man who promised eternity left nothing but ashes. A leader who demanded loyalty died, trusting no one. And an ideology that claimed strength collapsed in fear. History does not warn us with myths, it warns us with facts. Adolf Hitler was not defeated by enemies alone, but by his own obsession with control, his refusal to accept reality, and his belief that human life existed only to serve an idea. His final act was not defiance but surrender to the very destruction he created, and that is the real lesson history whispers from beneath the rubble of Berlin. When power becomes absolute and ideology replaces humanity, the end is always the same: silence, ruin, and ashes where empires once stood. In the final week of April 1945, Berlin was no longer a capital city, but a graveyard of a collapsing empire. The air shook day and night under the relentless thunder of Soviet artillery, each explosion announcing the end of Adolf Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich. Streets were buried under rubble, buildings burned uncontrollably, and civilians hid in basements as the Red Army closed in from all directions. Above ground, Germany was dying. Below ground, in a reinforced concrete bunker beneath the Reich's chancellery, Adolf Hitler waited for the end he had long foreseen but never truly accepted. The Führerbunker was not a place of command anymore. It was a tomb. Built to protect the Nazi leadership from air raids, it became the final refuge of a man who had once commanded millions. The bunker was dark, damp, and claustrophobic, filled with stale air, fear, and whispered rumors. Maps still hung on the walls, but they no longer reflected reality. Entire German armies marked on paper had ceased to exist. Yet Hitler continued to issue orders as if time itself could be bent to his will. By April 25th, Berlin was completely encircled. There was no escape route left. Hitler had been urged repeatedly by his generals and advisors to flee south to the Alps, where remnants of the Nazi leadership hoped to establish a final stronghold. He refused. For a man whose identity was inseparable from power and destiny, flight would have been an admission of failure. Berlin was the symbolic heart of his empire, and if it fell, he believed he must fall with it. Physically, Hitler was a shadow of the man who had once mesmerized crowds. His health had deteriorated rapidly. His posture was bent, his hands shook constantly, and his voice often faded into exhausted murmurs. Witnesses described him as prematurely aged, hollow-eyed, and emotionally unstable. Long periods of silence alternated with violent outbursts of rage, directed at generals, subordinates, and imagined traitors. He blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. Psychologically, he was trapped inside his own delusions. Hitler could not reconcile his belief in destiny with the reality of defeat. He had built his authority on the idea of infallibility, and to accept responsibility would have shattered the myth that sustained him. Instead, he concluded that the German people had failed him. If they could not win the war he had promised, then, in his mind, they did not deserve to survive. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere grew increasingly surreal. Secretaries typed final documents as shells landed nearby. Loyal officers came and went, saluting a leader they knew was already finished. Some still clung to blind devotion, others quietly prepared for their own survival. Betrayal, fear, and denial coexisted in the narrow corridors. Suicide became an openly discussed topic, not as tragedy, but as inevitability. On April 29, 1945, with Soviet troops only a few hundred meters away, Hitler made his final personal decision. In the early hours of the morning, he married Eva Braun, the woman who had remained by his side for years in relative obscurity. The ceremony was brief, almost mechanical. There was no celebration, no joy, only a sense of closure. Eva Braun, fully aware of what lay ahead, chose death alongside him rather than life without him. That same day, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. Even at the edge of death, he refused responsibility for the destruction of Europe. He blamed Jews, foreign powers, and disloyal generals for the war and its outcome. His worldview remained unchanged. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused, only bitterness and denial. As April 30th dawned, the sound of battle grew louder. Soviet forces were advancing street by street, building by building. The bunker trembled with each nearby explosion. There was no doubt that capture was imminent. Hitler feared being taken alive above all else. He imagined public humiliation, trial, and execution. He remembered the fate of Benito Mussolini, whose corpse had been displayed for the world to see. That image haunted him. He would not allow the same fate for himself. Shortly after midday, Hitler said farewell to those still present in the bunker. The goodbyes were restrained, almost cold. Many avoided eye contact. Some wept quietly. Others stood stiffly, bound by habit rather than loyalty. Eva Braun distributed cyanide capsules to staff members, a grim gesture that symbolized the end of all hope. Then Hitler and Eva Braun retreated into his private room. What happened next was swift and deliberate. According to consistent eyewitness testimony from those who later entered the room, Hitler took his own life by biting down on a cyanide capsule while simultaneously shooting himself in the head. Eva Braun died beside him after ingesting poison. There was no struggle, no hesitation. The act was planned, controlled, and final. Their bodies were discovered shortly afterward by Hitler's aides. Following his explicit instructions, the corpses were carried up to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, placed in a shallow shell crater, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. As flames consumed the bodies, Soviet artillery continued to fall around them. Even in death, Hitler sought to control his image, to deny his enemies a physical symbol of victory. Within days, Soviet troops overran the bunker complex. The war in Europe was effectively over. Adolf Hitler, the man who had plunged the world into chaos, was dead. Yet uncertainty soon followed. Soviet authorities recovered charred remains, but Stalin, driven by suspicion and political calculation, initially encouraged the idea that Hitler might have escaped. This ambiguity fueled rumors that spread across continents and decades, but the evidence told a consistent story. Dental remains recovered by Soviet forces were later matched precisely with Hitler's dental records, confirmed by his dentist's assistants. Eyewitness accounts from multiple individuals inside the bunker aligned in detail and chronology. No credible physical evidence ever supported claims of escape. The collapse of Nazi Germany left no room for secret flights or hidden refuges. Hitler did not die as a martyr, nor as a warrior. He died underground, isolated, surrounded by the ruins of his own ambition. His death on April 30th, 1945, was not an act of triumph, but of surrender. Surrender to reality, to defeat, and to the consequences he could no longer escape. The fall of Berlin and the death of Hitler marked the end of a chapter written in blood. But it also exposed a deeper truth about power and human nature. A man who demanded absolute loyalty died abandoned. A leader who promised glory delivered devastation. And an ideology built on hatred collapsed into fear and ashes beneath a shattered city. In that bunker, as the walls shook and the world he had shaped burned above him, Adolf Hitler faced the final result of his choices. Not legend, not escape, just an ending as dark and empty as the path that led him there. From the earliest days of Adolf Hitler's rise, Power was never simply a tool for governance. It was the foundation of his identity. His sense of self was inseparable from domination, obedience, and ideological certainty. As long as Germany appeared strong and victorious, this psychological structure held together. But when the tide of war turned, the same traits that had fueled his ascent began to corrode his mind. By the final years of the Second World War, Hitler's inner world was collapsing long before the Third Reich did. Hitler's psychological decline did not begin in the bunker. It was the culmination of years of isolation, absolute authority, and an increasingly distorted perception of reality. As early as 1941, after the invasion of the Soviet Union stalled, those closest to him noticed changes. He became more rigid, less willing to listen, and increasingly hostile to dissent. Military briefings that once involved debate turned into monologues. Generals were no longer advisors but messengers, expected to confirm his beliefs rather than challenge them. This shift was rooted in his obsession with infallibility. Hitler did not see himself as a fallible human leader. He believed he was guided by destiny. Every success reinforced this delusion. When France fell in 1940, his faith in intuition over strategy deepened. He began trusting instinct more than evidence, ideology more than logistics. Psychological reinforcement turned into psychological imprisonment. The more power he accumulated, the less capable he became of questioning himself. As the war intensified, Hitler's paranoia grew. He became convinced that betrayal lurked everywhere, among generals, civilians, even longtime loyalists. Any setback was interpreted not as strategic failure, but as sabotage or disloyalty.
This mindset destroyed the internal structure of Nazi leadership. Competent commanders were dismissed, sidelined, or executed.
Those who remained learned to survive by agreement, not honesty. Reality was filtered before it reached him, reinforcing his delusions and isolating him further from truth. Physically, his health deteriorated alongside his mental state. He suffered from tremors, insomnia, digestive problems, and extreme fatigue. Doctors prescribed a cocktail of medications, including stimulants and sedatives, which likely worsened his instability. Witnesses described mood swings that could shift from lethargic silence to explosive rage within moments. These were not merely stress responses. They were symptoms of a mind losing coherence under the weight of absolute failure. Hitler's refusal to retreat was one of the clearest manifestations of his psychological rigidity. Time and again he ordered German forces to hold positions at all costs, even when surrounded and outmatched. He believed retreat symbolized weakness, and weakness threatened the myth he had built around himself. Entire armies were sacrificed because he could not tolerate the idea of giving ground. Each decision deepened Germany's losses, and each loss pushed him further into denial. By 1943 and 1944, the gap between Hitler's perception and reality had become enormous. He spoke of secret weapons, miraculous turnarounds, and final victories long after defeat was inevitable. These were not strategic calculations, but psychological defenses. Facing reality would have meant confronting responsibility for unprecedented destruction. Instead, he constructed fantasies in which fate would intervene, enemies would collapse, and loyalty would triumph over material disadvantage. This psychological collapse had devastating consequences beyond Hitler himself. His paranoia poisoned the Nazi system. Fear replaced competence. Initiative vanished. Officers hesitated to act without direct orders, knowing that independent thinking could be interpreted as disloyalty. Germany's ability to respond flexibly to battlefield conditions was crippled, not by lack of resources alone, but by the psychological tyranny of one man. As Allied bombing intensified and cities turned to ruins, Hitler's worldview hardened further. He concluded that the German people had failed him. This belief marked a crucial psychological turning point. No longer seeing himself as a leader responsible for his nation, he reimagined himself as a judge. If Germany could not achieve victory, then, in his mind, it deserved destruction. This mindset culminated in orders to destroy infrastructure, industry, and resources, decisions that would have condemned surviving civilians to starvation and chaos. The bunker period exposed the final stage of this psychological unraveling. Cut off from daylight and reality, Hitler lived in a sealed environment that mirrored his mental isolation. Maps showed imaginary units. Reports were ignored if they contradicted his beliefs. He spoke of non-existent counterattacks while Soviet troops advanced through Berlin. The world above was ending, but inside his mind, the war continued on his terms. Paranoia dominated his relationships. He suspected even his closest allies of betrayal. Longtime companions were dismissed or humiliated. Loyalty was measured not by competence or service, but by willingness to share his illusions. Those who spoke honestly were removed. Those who agreed survived. In this environment, truth ceased to exist as a guiding force, yet beneath the delusion lay fear. Hitler feared capture, humiliation, and judgment. He feared being reduced from a symbol to a prisoner. This fear shaped his final decisions. Suicide was not an act of courage but of control. In death, he could preserve the last illusion of authority. He could choose the moment, deny his enemies satisfaction, and escape accountability. Psychologically, his end was consistent with his life. He could not exist without dominance, could not accept equality, and could not survive defeat. The same rigidity that once propelled him forward now ensured his destruction. There was no capacity for reflection, remorse, or moral reckoning, only collapse. The consequences of this psychological decline extended far beyond the bunker. Millions died because one man could not accept limits. Entire cities were destroyed because compromise felt like betrayal. The Nazi system, built on obedience to a single will, proved incapable of correcting itself when that will became detached from reality. Hitler's story is not merely one of evil ideology, but of unchecked psychological power. His decline reveals how absolute authority distorts perception, how fear feeds delusion, and how paranoia can turn leadership into self-destruction. When no voice is allowed to challenge, when belief replaces evidence, and when identity becomes fused with power, collapse is inevitable. In the end, Hitler was not defeated only by armies, but by his own mind, a mind that could not bend, could not listen, and could not accept reality. His psychological breakdown did not merely accompany the fall of Nazi Germany. It accelerated it, dragging a nation and a continent into ruin along with him. In the aftermath of Adolf Hitler's death, Europe lay in ruins, and so did certainty. The Third Reich had collapsed with stunning speed, leaving behind shattered cities, mass graves, and unanswered questions. Among those questions, none proved more persistent or emotionally charged than this: did Hitler truly die in Berlin, or did he escape justice? The chaos of the moment, combined with political manipulation and public disbelief, allowed doubt to flourish. Yet when the evidence is examined carefully, chronologically, and without myth, a clear and consistent truth emerges. Adolf Hitler died by suicide on April 30th, 1945, in the Führerbunker. When Soviet forces captured Berlin, they did not immediately announce Hitler's death to the world. The city was still burning, communication lines were broken, and Stalin himself distrusted information that did not pass directly through his control. Soviet troops discovered the ruins of the Reichsstadt ancillary and the bunker complex beneath it. In the garden area, they found a shallow crater containing partially burned human remains. These remains were not intact, but they were not random either. They were the result of a deliberate attempt to destroy identifiable bodies. The Soviets launched a secret investigation, conducted by Smersh, their military counterintelligence unit. Their task was to determine whether Hitler was truly dead. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, guards, secretaries, aides, and medical staff who had been present in the bunker during the final days. These testimonies were taken separately, under intense scrutiny, and often under fear. Despite this, the accounts aligned in crucial details: the timing, the method of death, the burning of the bodies, and the specific individuals involved. One of the most decisive pieces of evidence came not from dramatic discoveries, but from forensic science. Hitler's body had been burned extensively, making visual identification impossible. However, his dental structure was unusually complex. He suffered from severe dental problems and had numerous crowns, bridges, and distinctive dental work. Soviet investigators recovered a jawbone and several dental fragments from the remains found near the bunker. To verify their authenticity, the Soviets located Hitler's dental assistants and technicians, including Kathe Husermann, who had worked closely with Hitler's dentist. Without being shown the remains beforehand, she was asked to describe Hitler's dental work in detail. Her description matched the recovered jawbone precisely. When shown the dental fragments, she identified them immediately as Hitler's. This was not guesswork, it was a technical match that left little room for doubt. Decades later, after the Cold War, these findings were re-examined by Western historians and forensic experts. The dental divide. NCE was confirmed again. No credible scientific analysis has ever contradicted this conclusion. Dental identification, especially when involving unique and documented work, is one of the most reliable forms of forensic proof. In Hitler's case, it stands as one of the strongest confirmations of his death. Eyewitness testimony further reinforces this conclusion. Multiple individuals independently described Hitler's final moments, and the immediate aftermath. Heinz Ling, Hitler's valet, described discovering the bodies. Otto Gunsche, Hitler's adjutant, detailed the preparations for suicide and the burning of the corpses. Secretaries such as Trudel Junge provided consistent timelines of Hitler's behavior and final farewell. These accounts were given separately, under different circumstances, yet they aligned in structure and detail. Critics often point to minor inconsistencies as evidence of fabrication. But in historical investigations, especially under extreme trauma, minor variations are expected. What matters is the core agreement, and in this case the agreement is overwhelming. All credible witnesses place Hitler's death in the bunker on April 30th, 1945, by suicide. So why did escape theories gain traction? Part of the answer lies in politics. Joseph Stalin initially suggested that Hitler might have fled. This was not based on evidence, but on strategy. By keeping the West uncertain, Stalin maintained leverage and fueled distrust. The idea of a surviving Hitler also justified continued Soviet security measures in Eastern Europe. Political ambiguity became fertile ground for myth. Public psychology played an equally powerful role. For many, suicide felt like an inadequate punishment for a man responsible for unprecedented suffering. There was a deep emotional desire to see Hitler captured, tried, humiliated, and executed. Escape theories offered a strange comfort. By prolonging the story, keeping justice seemingly unfinished. In this emotional vacuum, rumors thrived. As time passed, these rumors evolved into elaborate conspiracies involving submarines, secret bases, and distant continents. Yet none of these claims produced physical evidence. No verified documents, no credible eyewitnesses, no remains, no confirmed photographs. Intelligence agencies in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union investigated these rumors extensively during the late 1940s and 1950s. All concluded the same thing: there was no evidence that Hitler survived the war. Declassified FBI and CIA files often cited by conspiracy theorists do not confirm Hitler's survival. They merely document reported sightings, many of which were quickly dismissed. Intelligence agencies are required to record rumors, not endorse them. The existence of a report does not equal validation. In fact, the sheer number of investigated claims and their consistent rejection strengthens the conclusion that no escape occurred. Logistically, an escape was nearly impossible. By late April 1945, Berlin was completely surrounded. Airfields were destroyed or under enemy control. Roads were blocked. Soviet forces were advancing within walking distance of the bunker. Hitler was physically incapable of enduring a long journey. Any attempt at escape would have required a massive, coordinated operation involving dozens of people, none of whom ever produced evidence or credible testimony. Most importantly, Hitler's own psychology contradicts the escape narrative. He did not plan for life after defeat. His writings, conversations, and final testament reveal a man who equated defeat with annihilation. He saw suicide as preferable to capture. Survival in hiding, stripped of power and symbolism, was incompatible with his self-image. Escape would have meant living anonymously, powerless, and dependent on others, the very existence he despised. The consistency of evidence across decades, nations, and disciplines leads to a single conclusion. Hitler did not escape. He did not vanish into legend. He died as his world collapsed, choosing death over accountability. The persistence of doubt says more about humanity than about history. Myths endure when reality feels insufficient, but history is not obligated to satisfy emotional expectations. It is obligated to tell the truth, and the truth is stark and final. Adolf Hitler died in Berlin, underground, defeated not only by enemy armies, but by the consequences of his own actions. No escape, no survival, no hidden ending, just a closed chapter, sealed by evidence, confirmed by science, and written into history with irreversible certainty. The end of Adolf Hitler should have closed one of the darkest chapters in human history, yet instead it opened a long corridor of doubt, rumor, and speculation. Long after the gunshot echoed inside the bunker, and the flames consumed the remains in the garden above, stories began to circulate that refused to die. These stories did not emerge because evidence was missing, but because belief is not governed by facts alone. The survival of conspiracy theories about Hitler's fate reveals something deeper about politics, psychology, and the human need for meaning when reality feels incomplete. In the immediate aftermath of the war, confusion was unavoidable. Europe was shattered, governments were collapsing, and communication was fragmented. Berlin itself was a ruin, its streets filled with smoke, rubble, and bodies. In this chaos, certainty was fragile. The Soviet Union, which had captured Berlin, controlled the physical evidence and the first investigations. Joseph Stalin, a man defined by suspicion and strategic calculation, chose ambiguity over clarity. Publicly, he suggested that Hitler might have escaped. This was not a conclusion drawn from evidence, but a political maneuver. By allowing uncertainty to spread, Stalin gained leverage. A missing Hitler kept the West uneasy and distracted. It justified Soviet control over Eastern Europe under the banner of continued vigilance against fascism. It also reinforced Stalin's narrative that enemies were always lurking, always plotting. In this environment, truth became secondary to utility. Silence and contradiction from official Soviet sources planted the first seeds of doubt, and those seeds found fertile ground in a traumatized world. At the same time, the Western public struggled to emotionally process the idea of Hitler's suicide. For millions who had lost family members, homes, and entire futures, suicide felt insufficient. There was no trial, no public reckoning, no visible punishment equal to the scale of the crimes. Death came too quickly, too privately. Many felt cheated by history itself. This emotional dissatisfaction created space for alternative explanations, because an escaped Hitler felt more acceptable than a Hitler who chose his own end. Psychologically, conspiracy theories often emerge when events feel disproportionate. The greater the crime, the greater the desire for dramatic justice. Hitler's death lacked spectacle. There was no gallows, no courtroom, no final confession. Instead, there was a bunker, a locked room, and ashes. For many, this ending felt wrong, almost insulting in its simplicity. Conspiracy theories restored drama where reality offered only bleak finality. Media also played a crucial role in sustaining these myths. Sensational headlines sold better than quiet conclusions. Stories of secret submarines, hidden bases, and distant sightings captured public imagination far more effectively than forensic dental reports. Over time, speculation became entertainment. Books, documentaries, and rumors blurred the line between investigation and fiction. Each retelling added new details, not because they were true, but because they were compelling. The Cold War further amplified this distortion. Mutual distrust between East and West meant that Soviet evidence was automatically questioned in Western circles. If Moscow claimed Hitler was dead, some assumed deception by default. Conversely, Soviet secrecy fed Western suspicion. Truth became another casualty of ideological conflict. Even when intelligence agencies quietly reached the same conclusion, that Hitler was dead, the public narrative remained fractured. Declassified intelligence files later became fuel for misunderstanding. Reports documenting alleged sightings of Hitler in foreign countries were misinterpreted as proof of survival. In reality, intelligence agencies record rumors as part of their duty. They investigate claims not because they believe them, but because ignoring them could be dangerous. When these files were released decades later, stripped of context, they appeared to validate the myths they were meant to eliminate. Human memory also played its part. As eyewitnesses aged and died, direct testimony faded. Distance from the event made it easier to doubt. With fewer living voices to anchor the story, imagination filled the gaps. Each generation inherited the mystery without the immediacy of the suffering that once demanded accuracy. Over time, Hitler transformed from a historical figure into a symbol, and symbols are easily reshaped. There is also a darker motivation behind some conspiracy theories, the desire to keep evil alive. For extremist groups, the idea that Hitler survived allows his ideology to feel unfinished rather than defeated. It transforms him from a failed dictator into a ghostly presence, forever threatening to return. In this way, denial of his death becomes denial of his failure. Accepting his suicide means accepting that his worldview ended in collapse and humiliation. Ironically, the persistence of these myths undermines the real lesson of history. Hitler did not escape justice. He embodied it. He died abandoned, powerless, and afraid, his empire reduced to ashes. His end was not glorious, but that is precisely why it matters. The truth shows that absolute power does not end in triumph, but in isolation and ruin. Conspiracy theories survive because they serve emotional, political, and psychological needs. They offer comfort where reality offers discomfort. They replace finality with continuation and certainty with mystery. But history is not a story designed to satisfy desire. It is a record of what happened, regardless of how unsatisfying it may feel. The refusal to accept Hitler's death is, in many ways, a refusal to accept that evil can be banal at its end. There was no dramatic reckoning, only a small room, a broken man, and a final decision born of fear. That ending strips ideology of its power. It reveals not a monster beyond humanity, but a human being consumed by his own delusions. Understanding why these myths persist is not about defending a historical detail. It is about recognizing how easily truth can be distorted when it collides with trauma, politics, and imagination. When facts are uncomfortable, myths rush in to take their place. In the end, the survival of conspiracy theories about Hitler's fate tells us less about what happened in Berlin and more about how societies process horror. We seek meaning, justice, and closure, even if we must invent them. But history demands something harder: acceptance. And the acceptance of Hitler's death as it truly occurred forces us to confront an unsettling reality: that the most destructive forces in human history do not always end with spectacle. Sometimes they end quietly, underground, leaving behind not mystery, but a warning. When Adolf Hitler died beneath the ruins of Berlin, history did not simply record the end of a man, it exposed a warning written in human blood. His death was not only the collapse of a dictator, but the final proof of what happens when power is worshipped, ideology replaces morality, and human beings surrender their conscience to belief. The lesson of Hitler's end is not confined to the past. It echoes forward, demanding to be understood rather than mythologized. Hitler's rise was made possible not only by his own ambition, but by a society willing to trade critical thought for certainty. Germany, in the aftermath of the First World War, was humiliated, impoverished, and desperate for meaning. Into that despair stepped a man who offered simple answers to complex problems. He promised pride, unity, and greatness while identifying enemies to blame for suffering. This formula was not unique to Hitler, but his ability to weaponize it was extraordinary. Power, once granted to him, became absolute, and absolute power reshaped reality itself. Ideology was the engine of this transformation. Hitler did not merely govern, he demanded belief. Loyalty was no longer to a nation or to humanity, but to an idea of racial destiny. Once ideology became sacred, morality became flexible. Acts that would once have been unthinkable were reframed as necessary, even virtuous. Violence became duty. Dehumanization became policy. Millions were reduced to numbers, categories, and threats. This is the most dangerous stage of power, when belief replaces evidence and identity replaces empathy. Hitler's Germany did not collapse overnight. It deteriorated gradually, decision by decision, compromise by compromise. Each step toward brutality was justified as temporary, necessary, or defensive. And with each step, resistance became harder, because people adjusted to the new normal. Evil did not arrive screaming, it arrived explained. As power consolidated, accountability vanished. Hitler surrounded himself with those who echoed his views and punished those who challenged them. Truth became unwelcome. Facts were reshaped to fit belief. This environment did not merely protect his delusions, it amplified them. When leaders are no longer contradicted, they stop learning. When ideology becomes identity, admitting error feels like self-destruction. In this state, power becomes fragile because it can no longer adapt to reality. The consequences were catastrophic. Strategic decisions driven by obsession rather than reason led to military disasters. Entire cities were destroyed because retreat was seen as weakness. Millions died because compromise was equated with betrayal. The suffering inflicted was not accidental. It was the logical outcome of a worldview that valued ideas over lives. By the time Hitler reached the bunker, the warning was complete. Absolute power had not made him strong. It had made him isolated. Ideology had not given him clarity. It had blinded him. Loyalty had not protected him. It had emptied the room. In his final days, he trusted no one, believed nothing that contradicted his will, and accepted no responsibility. The world he created could not save him because it had been built on denial. His suicide was not an act of control over fate, but the final evidence of failure. A man who demanded total devotion could not face judgment. A leader who claimed to embody destiny could not survive defeat. He chose death because life without power, without belief, without domination was meaningless to him. That is the ultimate cost of surrendering humanity to ideology. The danger revealed by Hitler's story is not limited to one nation or one era. It lies wherever leaders are elevated beyond criticism, wherever belief is protected from questioning, and wherever groups are reduced to enemies rather than humans. The conditions that allowed his rise were ordinary: fear, resentment, economic anxiety, wounded pride. These conditions recur throughout history, and when combined with charismatic certainty, they can once again erode moral boundaries. The universal warning is clear: power must be restrained by accountability. Ideology must be challenged by evidence. Identity must never override empathy. When people stop asking questions, when disagreement becomes treason, and when leaders claim exclusive access to truth, the path toward destruction opens quietly. Hitler's end strips away the illusion that evil is always dramatic. There was no throne, no battlefield victory, no heroic finale. There was only a bunker, ashes, and silence. This matters because it dismantles the false glamour of tyranny. It reveals that domination does not end in greatness, but in emptiness. That those who seek total control often lose everything, including themselves. History's greatest lesson is not that Hitler was uniquely monstrous, but that he was dangerously human. He exploited fear, fed resentment, and promised certainty. He succeeded because enough people believed without questioning, followed without thinking, and obeyed without resisting. His fall shows where that road leads, remembering this is not about reopening old wounds. It is about preventing new ones. The past does not repeat itself mechanically, but human nature remains vulnerable to the same temptations: the need to belong, the desire for simple answers, the comfort of blaming others. These forces still exist. When they are harnessed by unchecked power, the consequences are always tragic. In the end, Hitler's death offers no mystery, only meaning. It stands as a warning carved into history that when power is absolute, ideology is unquestionable, and humanity is expendable, collapse is inevitable, not only for nations, but for the individuals who surrender their conscience to belief. The silence that followed Hitler's final moment is not just the silence of a man's end. It is the silence that asks future generations whether they will listen, learn, and choose differently.